done in the past, like for last year? Those that said they're not in first?
I'm doing my Master's in Environment, just in my last year, or last semester.
Okay. Right, okay, and the same?
Yeah, last, yeah.
Okay. And so, what other masters are people doing? Food science? What else? Agribusiness? Crop production? Okay. Any packaging? Yep. Any graduate certificate people in the room? Yep. So what's your background?
I'm a coffee producer.
Coffee producer. Fantastic.
Taking 6 months off to pursue the certificate. 6 months.
Yeah. Great.
Going back on.
And so it looks like you might be the only grad cert. Are there any others? Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good spread of people, I think. And I think we're all going to be able to learn a lot from each other as well. And I think when we're at this stage of a master's or a grad cert, we're no longer students. I don't think we should call ourselves students. We're actually colleagues now. And so I think the best thing you can do, even if the lectures don't float your boat, is actually to come in, join in the lecture, because it's really the interaction between all of you that's important. And it's usually those interactions that bring with them the most knowledge, I think. Okay. Everyone see clearly? Right, so today it's going to be a fairly broad overview of the subject, okay? It's quite a complex subject, as you'll begin to see. And so I can't hope to sum up everything that you're going to be learning over the next 12 weeks. But I'm just going to try and mainly cover in some detail the structure of the course, because for this course you've really only got 2 tutorial sessions. So that's not a lot. So if you're finding that you need help, etc., there's not a lot of tutorials within to get that. So I think if we're upfront and pretty clear at the start of what the requirements are, then I think we're in a good place. So then I will talk about the modules that the subject's broken down into, of which there's 3. Talk a little bit about the assessment tasks, and then I'll give a very brief introduction to Module 1, and that will mainly be concerned with definitions and things like that that you'll need to know going forward into the following lectures. So, according to the handbook, the objectives of the subject are to define what's meant by the terms food security and insecurity, an overview of what causes it. Okay, there are many, many factors involved, but the particular focus of this subject is on the biological aspects of food security. So there are also socio-political aspects to this, of course, and you can't learn about the biological aspects without also taking into consideration the socio-political impact that that has. But that won't be, I guess, the main focus in this subject, as there are other subjects that cover that in more detail. You'll learn about vulnerability and resilience of food systems and what we might do to mitigate or adapt to different scenarios with climate change and the like. Current national and international focus on food policy. Securing food in a changing world, and some of the strategies around the world that have done that or in the process of doing that. and a practical grassroots approach to reducing food waste. And you'll hear from Rebecca Lindberg in week 3, and she's going to present a really good lecture on the whole food waste story. So I think you'll be really, really interested. Don't miss that lecture. Okay. Impacts of pests and diseases on food security. It's a very important aspect, and as you can see from the timetable, we actually give this a lot of weight. There's a lot of different aspects to this too. Pre- and post-farm gate methods for food protection and human health protection. And transformational changes aimed at increasing yield under the current and predicted climatic risks. So that will take into consideration things like genetically modified organisms and how we go down that path and what the barriers are when we're heading down that path. And also to develop within all of these objectives how you feel about different issues that come up in this subject. For example, what's your stance on intensive animal production? You know, chicken farms, feedlots, those sorts of things. So it's not really about the lecturers telling you how to think, it's about you developing your standpoint on a lot of these issues. So this is the format of the subject. So we're in the right room, and I think we're going to stay here. I think we've got about 128 students in the course, and that could fluctuate a little bit as we get towards the census date. So it looks like there's a few gaps, so not everyone's turned up, so that's okay. I think we'll be able to stay here. We won't be kicked out. So they're from 12 to 2 unless you're otherwise notified. And so the format of the subject is that it's broken down into these 3 modules. So the first one is more about learning definitions and also investigating the food security, insecurity subject. And then we move on to impacts of diseases. And then we'll move on to impacts of environment. So they're 3 different modules, and you'll have experts in the field taking you through those lectures. So as I said before, there's a focus on biological aspects in this particular subject on food security, and there'll be 3 assessment tasks, and I'll go into some detail about them in a minute. I've had a few questions already about the symposium. Don't be alarmed by it. It's only a 10-minute talk, so I know that presenting isn't always what people want to be doing, but it's an important step in communication. So that's why we hope that you will, put everything into that. You only have to come on one of the seminar or symposium days. At the moment there are 2, but because of the numbers of students, it may have to expand to 3 days, and I will give you plenty of notice if we have to also bring in a Wednesday for this. Okay. Ideally, we'd like you to be at the symposium that you're presenting in for the whole 6 hours. If you've got clashes, okay, that's life. Just tell me and we can sort something out, okay? But I think it's important to support your colleagues when they're presenting as well, okay? So you'll present for 10 minutes, but you'll be assessed by each other, and you'll also be assessed by 2 staff. And I think that in itself is a very important process. And you'll also have the opportunity to chair a session. Has anyone already chaired a session at a conference as yet? Or in a department symposium, something like that? Well, this is a really good opportunity to get some skills in that as well. So you can either opt to be a peer reviewer or you can opt to chair a session. So it'll just mean you might have to introduce a block of 6 speakers, 6 of your colleagues, and introduce the topic they're going to talk about. And then at the end, you'll direct questions that come from their talks. And because time is precious and I still haven't got my head around exactly how we're going to fit you all into these days, I think I'll probably have to do a limit of 2 questions per talk or something in that realm. And okay, as I said before, the tutorials, there's only 2 of them, so it's not, I think, too much to ask that you try and attend those 2, and it will give you some invaluable help towards getting your essay written if you've got any problems, and also it'll give you the chance to, in the second tutorial session, to maybe do a mock presentation or a practice run, something like that with your colleagues. Okay, so that's the timetable as it stands, and as I touched on earlier, I come in at the start and I come in at the end, okay? So I'm here to introduce and I'm here to sum up at the end, but that doesn't mean I'm not here. So I will actually be attending the other lectures, okay? And that gives the opportunity also for me to interact with you. If you've got any issues that come up in the next 12 weeks, I will be around during that time definitely, and also additional times as you need them. So we've got a great lineup of speakers, experts in these areas, which I could never hope to be. I could never hope to be an expert in all of these areas. So we've got experts on climate change and impacts on animal production, snow coming in, I think, week 9? Yes. So he's got all the clues on adaptation, mitigation strategies in agriculture. So that's another great lecture not to miss. What else do I have to tell you? Yes. So slides and lecture recordings will be available where possible on LMS. You don't have slides for today. What was there were slides from last year's introduction, okay? I think there's about 65 slides in last year's presentation. Lots of additional information to what I'm going to give you today, because I'd like to spend a bit more time on talking about this and giving you a brief overview than getting into the nitty-gritty, which the experts are far better qualified to do. Okay? So I apologise that there are no handouts for today, but by all means, tap into Helen's from last year, and you will also find at the bottom of all those slides some very important links that will take you to some great documents that might help you with your essays. Okay, so sometimes technology fails us. It's not today so far, touch wood. But we strongly encourage that you attend the lecture, and I touched on that earlier. It's not just about hearing us, it's about collegial support and interaction. This subject, when students filled in the SES, one of their comments was that it's very reading heavy, which it absolutely is, because all of these subjects are very topical at the moment. So yeah, I think probably if you have a look at the reading lists, it will be a bit overwhelming. But what I'll try and do over the coming weeks, I'll try and sort out what's appropriate to read for the lecture that's coming up, and then I'll also put some under an additional reading banner so that you don't feel pressured to read absolutely everything, but certainly in that additional reading section there'll be valuable things that will add something extra, an extra dimension to what you've read so far. Okay. And so documents related to the tutorials will be under that tab. Under that tab you'll find all of the topics for your essays, all of your topics for your presentations. You'll also find marking guides and the like. So all of the help that you need, all of the information that you need for the tutorials will be found there. And there'll also be a discussion board available, which once again is not for me. It's not for me to really communicate to you, it's for you to communicate with each other, which I highly recommend. So you just start a subject or topic and it creates a thread. So every time you enter, just make sure that your question or your topic has not come up before. And a tip, keep your comments brief, because it can get a little bit boring if people put really waffly answers in there. So try and keep it as brief and as interesting as possible, and if you've got any additional information that you come across that you find interesting, that you want to share, put it there. So this is the way the marks are allocated. So the essay, 2,000 words, is worth 30%. The seminar is worth 20%. And the exam is worth 50%, so it's got quite a high loading on the exam. So the essay is specifically to cover Module 1, the presentation Module 2, and the exam will cover 1, 2 and 3. So you'll expect that if you haven't been tested on the climate change aspects before, you're going to strike a question or two in the exam on that. Just a tip. So assessment task 1, the essay looks like this. You'll have a list of roughly 7 topics to choose from, and they'll be available soon. So I'm hoping to get those up there by week 2. And as I said, they'll cover topics in Module 1. So you submit your essay, 2,000 words plus or minus 10%, as a Word file through Turnitin. Is there anyone in the room that has not used LMS before or is new to it this semester? How are you finding it? Easy enough to use? Haven't used it yet. If you have any trouble, get in contact with me, okay? So there's a little portal there called Turnitin, and that's the way you put your essays in so that it can be scanned and checked for plagiarism. So that's what it's for. And then it gives us a match on, 5%, 50% match to various documents, etc. So the word limit excludes references. Okay, and there will be a marking guideline, as I said there, for you to look at about how those marks are allocated. And there's a good tab called Resource, or Resources, I think it is actually, which will give you all the information that you need about plagiarism, collusion, how to avoid it. That's a big issue, it's an important issue, and look, I know that sometimes it's hard to paraphrase exactly the way you want to. Don't be ashamed if you don't get it right all of the time, okay? But what we've got to try and strive towards is that you're not copying other people's work. It must be in your own words, and you must refer to the other person's work throughout your essay, okay? If you don't, then this Turnitin system will pick up on it, okay? And then we can alert you to the fact that it hasn't passed the plagiarism. Let's have a look at it, see how we can change it, okay? Don't be ashamed. It's a tool to help you write, and write well, and write ethically, okay? So Tute 1, it's held in week 4, so Thursday the 23rd of March or Friday the 24th of March. I think you've been allocated. I'm actually not sure on this. Have you been allocated to a particular tutorial session as yet through your registration? No. Okay, that kind of makes it easier. What I'll do is put up some Google Docs when I figure out how to do them. I'll put some up, and then you can choose the session that's going to suit you. Hopefully that works, but basically there'll be the 3 sessions available on each of those days. They're both in the 1 week. Done.
I've already read. You can register on the register site.
Okay. Oh, can you?
But some of them are full already. I think the tutor
All right.
all full.
Okay. If there's a burning desire to change, for whatever reason, if you've got a clash, just let me know. Okay, we'll try and sort something out for you. Right. So it's due week 6, Sunday the 9th of April. And what I suggest you do, don't rely on weeks. I don't know if I'm the only one who feels this way. I much prefer to rely on dates than week 1, week 2, whatever. Doesn't mean anything to me. But the date does. So I'm telling you now, Sunday the 9th of April is when it's due, okay? And I'm here if you need me. So, as I said, I'm taking up a bit of time talking about this, but I think it's worth it. So this is an example of one of the topics that you might see on offer as an essay choice. So they're quite hefty. They're quite meaty. There's a lot of sentences in there, and there's a lot of keywords. So what you would do in this situation, I've tried to highlight them here, is you'd pick out those keywords, and that's what's going to formulate the body of your essay, okay? As your master's, grad cert, I'm sure you've done, you know, heaps of essays, but it's still worth mentioning because not everyone gets structure right. It's an art, okay? So within that topic, you'll find all that you need to structure a decent essay, okay? And because some of us are from animal backgrounds, some of us are from plant backgrounds, there'll be a range, okay, so that you can choose what suits you best. So assessment task 2, the presentation. I'll have topics up for that, I hope, by week 4. And I don't think it matters if more than a few of you choose the same topic, but we'll sort that out maybe in a few weeks' time in more detail. So 10 minutes at this stage. That may have to change to 8 or something like that, depending on how many people we can fit in the one day. And so that's going to be held at this stage, Thursday the 4th of May, Friday the 5th of May, okay? And as I said, try and mark off the whole day if you possibly can. If that's impossible, mark off either the morning or the afternoon that you're presenting in. Because I'm going to need also enough people to peer review everyone, okay? And to chair sessions, because I don't want to chair them myself. So if you don't choose, and this will be another document that I'll post, you can choose what you would like to do, but if I find that nobody chooses to be chair, then I'm going to have to allocate it to people, and I'd prefer not to do that. And then there'll be quite a detailed marking guideline on what's required of you for your talk. And so that's an example of a seminar topic. So once again, it's broken down into a number of different subheadings. So that's what you would look at when you're trying to formulate what you actually focus on within your talk. And probably one strategy that I think is a good one is that a lot of people at the university enter what's called a 3-minute thesis competition. And it means that they've got to encapsulate all of their studies in the one slide for 3 minutes, and it's not a bad thing to practice. You know, if you will have more than one slide, more than likely, but how about if you limit yourself to 6. You'll have an introductory slide, concluding slide, and maybe 4 in between that you spend just a couple of minutes talking on each one. I think that's a pretty good strategy to start with. And as I said, Module 3 will be tested during the exam. So there'll be a couple of hefty questions on climate change. And so by the end of the subject, you'll be able to hopefully do all these things. Okay. For example, define the causes of food insecurity, explain the health risks, and discuss the challenges of securing food into the future. Okay, so are there any questions before I move on any of that so far? Fairly clear? Jolly good. Okay, so we'll move into Module 1, food security and food insecurity, the basics. So what is food security? The World Food Summit of 1996 suggests that food security exists when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. So it's a pretty nice definition. But in 2009 in Rome, at the World Summit on Food Security, it was expanded upon, and that's it there. So I can read it. A family is considered food secure when its members do not live in hunger or fear of hunger. Food security is defined as having 4 main components: availability, access, utilisation and stability. Families and individuals require a reliable and consistent source of quality food, as well as sufficient resources to purchase it. People must also have the knowledge and basic sanitary conditions to choose, prepare and distribute food in a way that results in good nutrition for all family members. Finally, the ability to access and utilise food must remain stable and sustained over time. So I think that's quite a detailed definition. And I will have these handouts up on LMS by the end of the week. Okay, so you don't have to jot it down. So the countries that were at the World Summit signed a declaration to uphold what they called the Millennium Goal number 1, and that was to halt immediately the increase in and significantly reduce the number of people suffering from hunger, malnutrition and food insecurity. And what they said was, we will reinforce all our efforts to meet by 2015 the targets of the Millennium Development Goal 1 and the World Food Summits. We commit to take action towards sustainability, eradicating hunger at the earliest possible date. Millennium Goal 1. The target of Millennium Goal 1 and the 1996 World Food Summit goal, namely to reduce respectively the proportion and the number of people who suffer from hunger and malnutrition by half by 2015. Okay, so that was partly achieved. The measurement period for that ended last year. So yes, we did reduce world hunger, but it's not good enough. There's still world hunger. And so we have to address that now. And I'm just going to play this video if it works. I might have to muck around a bit. No? Great.
The hidden GFC. The world might be in the process of rebounding from the global financial crisis, but did you know that we're experiencing another GFC? The global food crisis. This food crisis and the ways we use and store food. Changing climatic conditions also affect the amount of food available. Many experts predicting that this The hidden GFC. The world might be in the process of rebounding from the global financial crisis, but did you know that we're experiencing another GFC? The global food crisis. This food crisis is due to factors including population growth, decreasing land and resources like fuel and water, and the ways we use and store food. Changing climatic conditions also affect the amount of food available. Many experts predicting that this crisis will become worse in the next 40 years. This problem is frequently called food security. So what is food security? The Food and Agriculture Organisation defines food security as being a state when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. In some countries, food shortages have already caused riots, like those seen in Tunisia and Algeria, and there are often times of food insecurity even in countries like Australia or Japan. These are after interruptions to supply from natural disasters, like cyclones and earthquakes, or even droughts. Broadly, there are 5 main issues that we as a society need to address if there is to be global food security. Availability. Is there enough food to feed the population of the world? Accessibility. Does everyone have access to enough food every day? Acceptability. Does the food available meet cultural requirements? Adequacy. Is the food of sufficient quality and does it include all the nutrient requirements? Stability of source. Is it readily and always available? In Australia, we produce enough food for about 60 million people, but we only have 22 million people at the moment. Well, what's the problem then? There are 3 main reasons for Australia to be concerned about food security. The first is food availability. Floods, cyclones and droughts cause significant interruptions to food supply, and these result in big increases in price which affect people's quality of life. As more and more of the weekly income is spent on the grocery bill, less is available for other necessities and lifestyle purchases. The second reason is that Australian society is becoming increasingly urbanised. This means that the general population is becoming disconnected from the land and the way that food is produced. The way Australians see food and their attitudes towards it are affecting food security. Thirdly, Australia has a responsibility to lend a helping hand with global food supplies. Global food productivity needs to be increased by about 50% above the current levels in the next 40 years, and this needs to be done in changing climatic conditions. So there's lots of work to be done, but where do we start? We can start by recognising the importance of the food industry, which nowadays is very sophisticated and scientific. Australia has great technical skills to offer other countries. We need to build on these strengths by encouraging training and careers in agriculture to ensure ongoing research, collaboration and development. We also need to respect food. We need to understand what it takes to produce it and reduce our wastage of it. Start by growing your own veggie patch. We also need to improve the yield of our crops to ensure that we can meet global food demands. Increases in yields can be gained by a number of methods. Improvements in traditional plant breeding techniques, new technologies like genetic modification, selective breeding using DNA markers, and resource management will help to get more food from fewer inputs. We essentially need to do more with less. Improvements in our attitudes, plant breeding techniques, and accepting our responsibility to help ensure global food security will allow Australia to play a role in meeting the demands of a world population that is expected to be over 9 billion in the next 40 years.
Oops. Okay, that's it then. We can go. No, only joking. Okay. All right, I know what's going on. Best excuse me for a minute. That's better. Just when I thought I was being tech savvy. Okay, So what's food insecurity then? So food insecurity exists when people lack secure access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development. And it occurs when there are impediments, either physical, so people can't physically get to the food, even if it is available. Could be a problem of distance or mobility. Another impediment is social or economic situations. So there may be civil wars and or economic pressures that put pressure on the populations, such as those experienced in Somalia, Syria, South Sudan and a number of other places. And there may be problems with accessing food that are seen as being chronic, so the kind of extended periods of poverty and lack of assets as well, lack of wealth, and they're protracted. They may be transitory, so they might be short and temporary fluctuations, and that can happen on a year-to-year basis with variations in seasonal yield, for example. And they may be seasonal, so once again, seasonal fluctuations putting pressure on available food. So that certainly is a great cost to the economy when there are such vast fluctuations in the food that's available seasonally. So Foley, when talking about food insecurity, says increasing population and consumption are placing unprecedented demands on agriculture and natural resources. So food production must grow while our agricultural footprint must shrink. So we've got to be much more efficient with the inputs to that system also. So it also encompasses the sheer quantity of sufficient food that people have access to, and also the transport, how that food gets from one place to another, so supply and distribution, and also the access to quality, so how safe is that food. And it's complex, okay? So there's lots of different facets, there's lots of different causes, and we have to get to a stage where they're all working well together to have a hope of trying to fix the situation, I guess. So it encompasses all of these things. So physical and economic access to food, people's dietary requirements and needs, food preferences come into it as well. And that's for a range of reasons. It could be personal, it could be religious. Also, it has to be affordable, it has to be healthy, and it has to be acceptable culturally, because there's a lot of cultural reasons why food preferences are created. So how many people are food insecure? This fluctuates a little bit, but so the Food and Agriculture Organisation is under the umbrella of the United Nations, and in their report, in the period between 2014 and 2016, there's around 795 million people undernourished globally. So that's still way, way, way too many. And we still need to work hard to fix this, hopefully before 2050. So that's 1 in 9 people. And the breakdown of that is that 780 million are in developing countries and 11 million are in developed countries. So yes, there are many, many undernourished people in America, for example. So in terms of developing countries, and we'll come to that definition later, it's 1 in 8, okay? 1 in 8 people. Hot topic was the Paris Agreement. which was spoken about in 2015 and ratified by a number of different countries last year, November. So they had to get to the point where the amount of signatures that they got amounted to 55% of emissions before they could actually ratify it and put it in place. So all of these things take time. So far, 133 countries out of 197 parties to the convention have ratified the Paris Agreement, and so they call it, it's entered into force now, when at least 55 parties to the convention, accounting in total for the 55% of greenhouse gas emissions, sign the agreement. So that's a good thing, and hopefully that will increase rapidly. And so it asked for countries to put forward their intended nationally determined contributions as part of signing up. So it means that the countries are held accountable for those contributions which they actually signed their name to. So there's some accountability there, which is a good thing. So the major goal is that global temperature increase is limited to well below 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about climate change in a while. But also incorporated adaptation, finance, technology transfer, mitigation, capacity building, all of those things were all incorporated into sustainable goals, okay, which look like this. So in 2015, countries adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and that's what you're looking at now on the screen. In 2016, the Paris Agreement on climate change entered into force, addressing the need to limit the rise of global temperatures. The Food and Agriculture Organisation, or the FAO, as we call them, of the United Nations, developed some goals to move towards transforming our world. The 17 global goals are listed here, and we need to consider each and every one of them to be brought together in the hope that we'll move towards these goals. We'll have a look at one of them. So goal number 2, hunger and food security. So it's hoping that by 2030 we end hunger and ensure access to food by everyone, end malnutrition, double the agricultural productivity, which the video alluded to, and ensure sustainable food production systems. So by 2020, maintain the genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants and farmed and domesticated animals, to increase investment, to correct and prevent trade restrictions that are seen as an impediment to this process, and to adopt measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets to help limit extreme food price volatility. So this one is probably most likely the one that you will be visiting during this subject. But take a bit of time to have a look at this document and look at what was charted under each one of these. Okay, so the 4 main components of food security, as the video also said, was availability, access, stability and utilisation. So once again, these all need to interact. And the focus of this subject is to learn more about what are the drivers of insecurity surrounding plant and animal production, and how the flow of reliable sources of food may be achieved. And you can read more about the 4 principles of the Millennium Goal 1 in the document Declaration of the World Summit on Food Security, and I'm pretty sure that's in your reading list. If it's not, let me know.
Can you just go back to that last slide? The other one.
No.
Is that, because reducing the amount of food waste is obviously
Yeah.
a huge issue, but that doesn't...
I actually think that's under one of the other ones, because some of them cross over a little bit.
Yeah.
For example, number 1 is about poverty, so you'd sort of think that both of those go hand in hand. So yeah, I think food waste would be sitting under one of the others. There's a sustainability one too, so I'd be pretty sure it might be under that.
Yeah.
So some other definitions that you'll come across during the lectures: safe food. So this is food that will not cause harm to the consumer when prepared and or eaten according to their intended use. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Food safety, so actions aimed at ensuring that all food is safe as possible, and this considers the entire food chain from production to consumption. And so last year's World Health Day looked at that particular point and focused on that particular point. So from farm to plate, looking at food processing techniques, packaging techniques, point of sale, and then the consumers at the other end. And foodborne illnesses, you'll hear about these in the next probably 4 to 5 weeks. So diseases caused by infectious or toxic agents, so bacteria, viruses, parasites, chemicals, that enter the body through the ingestion of food. And some of these can be responsible for anything from diarrhoea to cancer. So that's fairly serious. And biosecurity is aiming to take some sort of control over that. Nutritious food, this is also fairly self-explanatory. Provides the materials necessary in the form of food to cells and organisms to support life. And I think we've all seen the food triangle before, which tells us to consume foods from each of those layers in the pyramid, less from the ones at the top and more from the ones from the bottom, basically, is what it suggests. But that all depends on your access, doesn't it, to these foods. So, undernourished people are those whose dietary energy consumption is less than a predetermined threshold, food deprivation, and that's an FAO description. So the threshold is country specific, so there's a whole lot of modelling in there, which enables them to determine these thresholds. And it's measured in the number of kilocalories it takes to conduct sedentary or light activities. And malnutrition generally refers to both undernutrition and overnutrition, but mostly you find that it's used for undernutrition. But overnutrition, obesity, is also a huge problem. But we don't tend to think of that also being malnutrition, do we? Okay, so other definitions: food preference, cultural, individual, and opportunity. So it's a selection of one food over another. And so I was trying to find a few pictures that sort of indicated a bit of food preference. And has anyone tried any of these foods in the room? What have you tried? Crickets. What are they like?
It depends on how you cook it, I think. Sometimes it's savoury, sometimes it's kind of bland. So
Yeah, but not too bad.
if I don't see it as how it is,
Yeah.
it's okay.
Yep. I've tried puffer fish in Japan, and I didn't die, so that was good. I don't know. I don't know whether I'd be willing to try a rat, but I have a choice, don't I? And I guess, what's beyond the comprehension of some of us to eat? Maybe the delicacy of another. And would we be prepared to eat these if that was our only source of protein, for example? I think we're pretty lucky that we can make that choice. So, could we view these foods differently if our circumstances changed? something to think about. So as I said before, preferences could be because of your genetic makeup. You may have intolerances and allergies. You may have religious beliefs or personal philosophy which means that you exclude certain things from your diet. And also cultural traditions also have an impact on what people choose to eat. And changes in socio-economic status, such as the increased consumption of red meat in China is just one example. How are we going for time? Okay, biosecurity is a pretty big one. It's kind of a hard one to define, and I think sometimes, depending on which discipline you're in, you tend to focus on one thing and maybe not necessarily the other. So when I think of biosecurity, I tend to automatically think of plants, but of course it also covers animals, but it also covers a whole lot of other things besides those as well. It's a big topic in itself, and so I'm going to get Tonya Rachel to come and speak to you about biosecurity later on in the course. Okay, this is an interesting one. So developed and developing countries, a bit controversial, this one. But I think that when we think about developed countries, what we're looking at is the fact that they've got adequate political stability. That's there, it's a given. A functioning government, adequate health, security and energy, and access to adequate food. And developed countries, maybe some examples would be, besides the usual ones that you normally think of, Norway, Germany, France. So developing countries, they might be countries that have less of these things available to them. Maybe not all of the time, or maybe not all of these things. And their economic conditions are sort of in a state of improvement. They're having infrastructure built and their health's improving, that sort of situation. So maybe Papua New Guinea, Nepal, Albania might be good examples of that. And so these countries were listed under the DFAT website as being developing countries. Countries in transition is a little bit grey, because you could also sometimes describe them as being developing. So I've just put an example there of Vietnam. It's emerging from a civil war that happened quite a long time ago, but with the global involvement, there was a trade embargo, so they had serious lack of trade with the rest of the world there for a while. And they're transitioning out of that from what was a centrally controlled government to a more socialist and then a more entrepreneurial society. So perhaps that would be in that transitional phase. Other examples, southeastern Europe, so Albania, Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, some of the Commonwealth of Independent States, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine. And these definitions of countries in transition are from the UN. And you can see that Albania is in both. It's in developing, it's in transition. So what do you think? Do you agree with these definitions? Anyone want to comment? It's pretty subjective, I would have thought. In fact, it's so subjective that I don't think it's all that useful. And it's so subjective that the World Bank and the UN will no longer define countries in this way. Countries are so vastly different from each other in all sorts of ways that this is no longer a very useful, productive way of comparing countries and what they're facing. So I guess this is an open question. You know, what's your view? So, the World Food Programme 2015 stated, there is enough food in the world today for everyone to have the nourishment necessary for a healthy, productive life. So why then are 795 million people malnourished? And so I'm going to hand it over to you to come up with some reasons. Why do you think this is the case?
Waste.
Yeah?
Resource distribution.
What else?
Accessibility.
Absolutely. Yes. Any others?
Food deterioration.
Food
Deterioration.
deterioration, yeah. Spoilage before it can actually get to people, yeah. Education, definitely, yes. That's a big one. That's a big topic in itself. Access to power. So, it's complex, isn't it? I mean, there are so many reasons. There are so many causal factors. How do we try and sort it out? But we've got to start somewhere. But probably some of these things listed here are those that threaten food security the most. I'd probably put politics up the top, not because it's the be-all and end-all, but because usually if things are going along well, then that could be one very fast impediment to progress. And then all of these other things are working together and need to work together to actually create food security. And some of those you said, and some of those, yeah, you might think about now and just sort of maybe investigate those a bit further. But yield is also a problem, given climate change and the like. And because I'm giving the lecture and I have a little bit of poetic licence, I'm going to take you into my world for just this slide. So when we think of yield in animal production, for the agricultural scientists in the room, how do you describe yield when it comes to animal production? It's usually, like in case of beef, it's usually the weight of the carcass after it's been deboned. Okay? But what we don't think about with animal production is how is yield actually made? And I think we have to think a little bit more deeply than that. We have to think about impediments, possible impediments to yield, things that we might not be able to change that are intrinsic with the production system that we're working with. For example, how many offspring can animals produce? Are we able to change that? A lot of the time not. Are we able to change gestational periods? No. Okay. And when we're thinking about crops, what I want you to take on board with this slide is that really yield is driven at a microscopic level. So on the right-hand side, that's one of my images, using a scanning electron microscope. If you can imagine a bud on a grapevine growing out in the field, inside that bud that's covered in all sorts of bud scales is next year's crop. Okay? It's forming in there. So whatever we need to do to manipulate, increase, decrease, whatever, to yield, we have to think about it. Sometimes 2 years in advance to actually get the result later. Okay? And what this micrograph shows is the apical meristem, so the stem cell centre of the plant. Okay? And the IP1, IP2 that you see there, they're actually inflorescence primordia, and what that means is they will be eventual flowers, and then they will be the eventual bunch of grapes. And I took this 18 months before that crop of grapevines bud burst and grew in the field. We call it bud burst when the bud breaks open and the shoot grows out. So I was able to tell that from this particular bud there were going to be 2 bunches from it, and I was able to tell 18 months before, okay, this is just one, but if you factor that up to a representative population, you get some sort of idea about how to estimate yield, and then if you can do that, you might also be able to adjust it in some way. So if you're finding that when you're doing this kind of work, that your crop is going to be huge and you're just not going to be able to handle that for all sorts of reasons through the production line, you might choose at this point to prune differently. You might choose to prune off half of your vine, for example, so that you can actually alter that yield. So I think it's something important to keep in mind. Yield doesn't mean it doesn't just mean kilograms per hectare, kilograms per acre. It means a lot more than that, and it's actually at a microscopic scale. And this picture on the left is actually of barley inflorescences as well. So whatever we need to do to disrupt, manipulate, change yield, we have to deal with it at this point in time. Have I made my point? Good. Okay, so a global focus. So approximately 195 countries in the world today, comprised of 193 that are members of the UN and 2 that are non-member observer states, so the Holy See and the State of Palestine. So global population has reached over 7 billion, with the highest populations in Africa and Asia, and that's not unexpected. And Australia comes in at about number 53 in terms of its population of 24.5 million. This map is a hunger map from the World Food Programme, which also operates under the UN. And I like this map because if you're like me, maybe you're not, but I get confused about where all the countries sit in Africa. Does anyone else have an issue with that? There are so many of them that sometimes it's actually hard to know where they all sit in relation to each other. And this map shows nicely a name for all of the countries there. It also gives us a key. So, for example, here, very low hunger, up to this grey spot here, missing or insufficient data. So why do you think that that's there, that grey spot? Have a look at the countries if you can see them, just to see where those grey spots lie. Exactly. So they're usually countries that are under very high stress, or the data is not accessible for one reason or another. Okay, and that's certainly the case with some of those countries around sub-Saharan Africa and places like Papua New Guinea, for example. So the map essentially shows the prevalence of undernourishment in the population of developing countries between that 2014 to 2016 period, and the indicator measures the probability that a randomly selected individual in the population is consuming an amount of dietary energy which is insufficient to cover his or her requirements for an active and healthy life. So mostly tropical regions are the most vulnerable. So sub-Saharan Africa, 25% undernourishment, and South Asia, 17% undernourishment. And that's the focus of a lot of the food programs at the moment. Here's another map. This one's done by the UN. I don't like this one because it doesn't really tell me all that much. For a start, it's got no names on it. And secondly, the less than 5%, very low category, looks exactly the same as the missing or the insufficient data. So, you know, it's undiscernible to me. I can't make out the difference between those two shades of cream. I also can't see that well, but that's beside the point. And, you know, they're vastly different. The countries in those two groups are vastly different. So I think you've just got to be a little bit careful when you look at these maps. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about world population growth. So this was the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the Population Division, that did this model. So it shows the world population prospects in a revised paper in 2015. So what it's showing is a mixture, I guess, of the actual population in the black line, and then with projected population in the red. And when we hear the term projected, okay, it doesn't, you've got to be careful, it doesn't actually mean that's what they're saying it will be. It's projected. It's their best guess based on all of the models that they use to pump into this one. So usually they'll have a number of different factors that they take on board. You know, it could be undernourishment, it could be infant mortality rate, it could be a range of things that they consider when they're doing these models. And with it, it's statistically sound. They've put it within confidence intervals. So it means that there's a bit of give and take in the model, that they're 95% sure that it'll fit within that upper line, okay? So there's some uncertainty built into this model, as can be seen by those confidence intervals, and taking the median projection variant, which is the solid red line, we assume that decline of fertility for countries where large families are prevalent, there's a slight increase in fertility for those countries with fewer than 2 children per woman on average. And the model can say with 95% certainty that the global increase in population will be somewhere between 8.4 and 8.6 billion in 2030. So the model also suggests that there could be a 23% change, that global population could stabilise or begin to fall before 2100. And that's where you can see the red line tailing off a little bit. And where does Australia fit within this? Well, as I said, about 24.5 million. I think it's around 35 million for Australasia, or Oceania, potentially. And that was a fairly recent figure from February the 28th, based on the latest United Nations estimates. So we are 0.33% of the total world population. And we rank number 53 in that list of populations. So also interestingly, we're all based around the urban areas pretty much, almost 90%. So you pretty much find Australia's population around the coastal regions. So yes, 3 people per square kilometre. And the median age is 37.6 years, whereas I think on a world basis it's something like 29 years is the average. So threats. Land availability is certainly one of them. So we have to learn how to use our land more efficiently. We have to produce more food on less land. And with urbanisation, there's a lot of people moving towards the cities that are possibly using some of the land that would have or could be used for agricultural purposes. And when there's population growth, there's demand on resources, all sorts of resources. Food, water, energy, to name a few. And can that demand meet the supply? And as I said, there's population centralisation, urbanisation, and there's good reasons for that. But it does mean that it puts the rural population at risk of food insecurity. Quite often they lose their livelihoods. And also it encroaches on that valuable land that we could be using for something else. I'm not sure what the solution is for that. And also the affordability and pricing. So if we can't meet demand, then that forces prices up, not just nationally, but globally. And this is happening in fluctuation all the time. And it puts a lot of pressure on households. Food waste, which was mentioned by a couple of people, very important. How do we deal with that? That's a big issue as well. And we'll be covering that in a few weeks' time. Rebecca Lindbergh. Okay, and water resources and security, fluctuations in water supply. Sometimes it's ephemeral anyway, but sometimes there are other pressures put on our water supply, such as drilling into underground aquifers to access water, which then, unfortunately, might then deplete the water basin underneath, and also there's impediments to flow in catchment areas. If people are building dams to capture their own water supply, that can seriously affect what would normally have flown down the stream into other catchments for use by everyone. So we have to reduce our agricultural footprint and double the quantity of food that we grow on it by 2050. That's the aim. So we need to improve the production of the crops we grow and the animals that we farm. And so this is what agricultural scientists call intensification. Cultural drivers of food insecurity, we've already fairly much touched on this. So war and human conflict, and I gave those countries as examples earlier. But it can strongly determine people's access to available food, and food can be used as a weapon against people. Food preference, religion, intolerances, values, cultural beliefs. Population drives this supply and demand situation. Wealth. How wealthy is a country? How wealthy are the people who are down the line, who are maybe middle class, lower class? Are they actually also wealthy? Don't know. So there's all those issues. Individual wealth as opposed to wealth of the country. Not always the same thing. Look at America. And country. There's some serious repercussions of being landlocked. Look at South Sudan. So they're actually relying on things crossing their borders. They don't have access to a port or any of those sorts of things that a lot of other countries find beneficial. Kind of like a sitting duck in the middle of Africa. Environmental impact on food insecurity. There's many of these. Seasons, we talked about before, they fluctuate. Climate change brings with it increased temperature, increased extremes of temperature, so heat waves, extreme events, floods, fire, and some of the things that we can do maybe to adapt to that is alter harvest dates, but I'll go into a few more details on that in a minute. And also protracted, extended periods of heat and flood can do enormous damage. extreme weather events, cyclones. But we've still got these underlying issues that we've always had in agriculture: salinity, erosion, disease pressure. They're just factored up under climate change. They're still there, but they're actually potentially going to get worse. And then there's a few dilemmas within this whole process, and these are just a few that I thought of. So the need to feed millions versus less than ideal animal production. I think we need to have some sort of a stance on that. Figure out how you feel about that. Not always are intensive agriculture systems unethical, but sometimes they most certainly are. So I think we need to accumulate as much knowledge on this as we possibly can, so that we're very well informed on this issue. So it's the balance between ethical and moral. How are we going to feed everyone if we don't intensify these practices? And if we do, how are we going to do it? And what are we going to put up with? You know, how much cost are we prepared to pump into antibiotics to keep caged chickens healthy? That's just one example. And I'm not going to force my opinion on anyone. It's for you to decide. But I think we need to know a lot more about this. And if I had have had a little bit more time leading up to running this subject, I probably would have organised an excursion. I think it would have been really useful to go and visit some of these places. I certainly have never visited them. I've relied on what I've heard from various scientists or people on TV, but I've never actually visited one. And I think we need to, potentially. Growing plants in a monoculture can reduce biodiversity and increase the risk of disease, absolutely. Look at bananas, look at grapevines, look at all sorts of different crops, you name it. If they're grown in a monoculture, some of them are very susceptible to disease. It's not necessarily meaning that we're going to change practices completely, but we have to work out how we're going to deal with that. We have to work out whether we're prepared to introduce some genetic modifications into those. And what's your view on that? It's worth thinking about. And it's not a cut and dried thing. It's not toxic. Producing animals using high-density farming practices may lead to poor animal welfare and increased risk of disease. So I've already covered that. And there's another one, so the breeder's dilemma. The emphasis of traditional crop production on yield can be counterproductive for human nutrition. Pressure to create higher yields and lower farming costs may inadvertently lead to crops with lowered nutritional quality. Do we actually want that? We have to think about that too. What is the impact of some of these adaptation strategies? Okay, we're nearly there. Climate change. So at the moment, as of February the 11th, 2017, 406 roughly parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere and rising. So the graph shows recent monthly mean carbon dioxide measurements at Mauna Loa Observatory, so that's in Hawaii. And those measurements are taken by the NOAA, and that stands for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. So it shows the last 4 complete years on record and the current year. So data is reported as dry air mole fraction, defined as the number of molecules of carbon dioxide divided by the number of molecules in the air, including carbon dioxide, after water vapour has been removed. And so that mole fraction is then expressed as parts per million. So that's how they work it out. And that's what they do at Mauna Loa, and they do it every day, and they've been doing it for, I don't know, just a guess, more than 70 years potentially. So it gives us a really good indication of how our CO2 in the atmosphere is travelling over time. What do you think the red line is showing on the left-hand graph? What could that be due to? Yeah, deciduous versus non-deciduous plants. Okay, so you're going to have varying levels of CO2 in the atmosphere at various parts of the year. So what they've done is draw a line in the middle of the month through all of those fluctuations, and that's what the dotted black line shows. Okay, what else? Oh, yeah, I should mention that it's at an altitude of 3,400 metres. So it could potentially not be exactly the same as what it is at sea level. But hopefully it's reasonably uncontaminated air. But anyway, there are a number of these observatories around the world that collect this data. And when we have it all, it's a powerful tool. Also need to say that there are also, there's some variation built into these models too. And it's a very topical, topic still. And just in the last 2 days, I don't know whether anyone else has seen these crop up in the conversation. So I think Tuesday and yesterday. So here's just 2 examples of some of the articles that are being written about the climate change impacts on our staple crops. And the one on the right was written by somebody at the university here. And so they were talking about the impact of heat stress on cattle and how we should be moving towards planting more trees so that they're shaded in these very long, protracted heat wave scenarios. So keep your eyes open for bits of information like this that filter through. The conversation's really easy to read. It sort of cuts out all the scientific ramble and condenses it down into a very readable form. And then, if you want more information, you can always go to the link which takes you to all of the scientific data that supports the conversation. So, well worth having a look at. And I'm sure that you'll find many, many more articles on this, even just this semester. There is a national policy on food as well that might be useful for you in your essays. It's called the National Food Plan, Our Food Future. I don't know that there's a link to that on LMS, but I'll work on that. And it's been put together by the Australian government. And so it's produced a whole lot of goals to 2025 to produce food sustainability. And that's just some of the goals that are listed. I don't expect you to read all of them now. But just know that that document's available and it tells you about what Australia's doing towards moving towards a sustainable goal. Land and water resources is a huge topic. It really is. So I can't do it justice today, but Snow will talk about this topic, land and water resources, in amongst climate change and also in amongst the energy debate. So you'll get a bit of all of those topics coming into play later in the semester. And we've got to think about how we manage our resources to ensure food security, because we need to do more with less water. So how do we grow our agricultural crops when we're under water stress? There are a couple of ways, just on a very sort of micro level. Things like deficit irrigation, for example, partial root zone drying, where you're actually controlling the amount of water that's getting to your plants. And this can be driven by measurements of the transpiration, which then will tell us when that plant needs water. So we can actually, to some degree, supply water at exactly the rate and quantity that's required. And there's lots of research that's going on around possibilities for these kinds of systems to be put in place. I've worked on a couple of them myself, so there's a bit of information out there on that if you're interested. And I tried to jot down a few ideas about how I'd tackle summarising energy. And as you can see there, I mean, that's a massive task. You have to take into consideration all of the fossil fuels that we like using, that we have access to, those that the world uses, and then have a look at why they're using them, how are they getting access to them. Sometimes it's because we're supplying them to them. It opens up a whole can of worms. There's a lot to this debate, and how we go about moving towards more renewable sources of energy, and where the money for the infrastructure is going to come from to do this. I think it's a long-term prospect, but people are certainly moving towards it, both globally and nationally. It's just going to take some time. But there's always something emerging as well. So Snow will bring in some of this debate, as I said, when he talks to you a little bit later on. And this will all be covered in Module 3. Crop adaptation strategies, just a grab. It's not an exhaustive list, there are many of them, but I just thought, well, you could go vertically, couldn't you? Instead of thinking in the one dimension, you can plant crops vertically. And I know that Burnley is doing a lot of work on green roofs and vertical gardening, which is excellent research. Okay, it's at a small scale at the moment, but we can potentially exploit that on a grander scale. Farming at altitude. In the grape and wine industry, people are considering planting their crops at a higher altitude, because that might delay the date in which those grapes are harvested, for example. And if they don't move towards those sorts of situations, what we find is that not only are we getting a hotter set of the climate is warmer when we're harvesting, but it's also earlier. So we have to come up with ways in the industry where we can adapt to that. That's just one of them. Another one might be different regimes of pruning, leaving some sides shaded, for example, so that your crop isn't burnt, sunburnt, or shrivelled to a crisp. Change of crop production, so you can switch over to different crops. Sometimes that's easy for broadacre, not so easy if you're growing grapevines, because even though it can be done to actually cut your trunk and then graft something else onto it, it's economically not so viable. You can change planting dates as well, so that you're not harvesting your crop in a really vulnerable time. You can use different varieties, and there are different varieties of all sorts of crops emerging every day. We can also look and learn to other countries, to what they're growing. Maybe trial them here, see if they work well here too. A lot of the time, there's somewhere in Australia that can grow just about anything. So yeah, use different varieties, alter yield up or down. I spoke about how you'd even think about doing that earlier. Alter harvest date, you can do that by pruning. You might be able to prune later, okay? And then harvest when it's not vulnerable. adjusting marketing arrangements, optimising irrigation, some of those techniques I spoke about, partial root zone drying, deficit irrigation. Managing soil nutrients and erosion. We've got to manage our fertilisers, got to manage the cost of fertilisers. We've got to work out where they're going, if there's runoff. We also have to still keep an eye on what's happening with erosion. Don't let all these other things take us away from this issue as well. It's been important for decades, as well as salinity. And how about precision viticulture? Is there anyone who's done any precision viticulture in the not viticulture, agriculture, precision agriculture? What that does is it builds up a layer. So you might get data on soil, you get data on yield, you get data on the most profitable parts of your land, and you overlay them one on top of the other. And then you might be able to differentially harvest. You can take this parcel here and make a lot more money. You can take this parcel here and put it into a blend, for example, that might not give you as much money. But precision agriculture, I keep saying viticulture because I'm a viti person, but agriculture is an innovative, incredibly important tool for agriculture. Not just for plants, but for animal production systems as well. So, livestock adaptation strategies towards 2030. So, what we've got to work towards is matching animal numbers to changes in pastures. More farms that mix crops and livestock, potentially. That might be an option. Controlling the spread of pests, weeds and diseases. And let's not forget about fisheries as well. They're part of this. Switching to more abundant species. Restoring degraded habitats and breeding sites like mangroves. Strengthening infrastructure such as ports and landing sites. Another very it's also very topical, and the ethics around fisheries has been in the news of late. So think about how you feel about these things. So on a bright note, it's not all doom and gloom. There are people that are doing some really good stuff, really cool stuff. Did anybody see Brian Cox's documentary a couple of nights ago? Well, in that, he talked about this seed vault. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. It's in Norway. And so, yes, it's 1,300 kilometres from the North Pole. It's freezing. But the government of Norway, as well as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, came together and collected seed from every country in the world, and they've put it in this vault. It's way underground. It's protected. It's a controlled environment, and they've got something like, I think it's 800,000 species in there. And that's so that we can ensure that we preserve genetic diversity in a way that protects them from all sorts of natural disasters, earthquakes and all sorts of things like that. But it's securing our future. You know, if these seeds are held in a controlled environment, they could last, I don't know, maybe hundreds, if not thousands of years. Some seeds do. But in any case, they'll be there should the next generation need them. Or if we find that we've got so many monocultures, we need to go back to some of these varieties. They're going to be there for us to access. I think this is awesome. I think that is just fantastic. It's free. So why wouldn't countries do this? Why isn't there more of this? And what can we do in our own backyard? Who's a part of a community garden? Is there one near you? Yeah.
There's one here.
And there's one here, absolutely. And there's a couple in Carlton, and this one's in St Kilda. There's quite a lot of them. If you're interested, check them out. Grow your own food. Fruit, vegetables, maybe meat. Might be possible. When you plant something, save the seed and share the seed. And that will protect genetic diversity. And also, awareness of consumption and waste. We have to be more aware of that. Our own waste, not just everyone else, but our own. We've got to take ownership of that, what we do with that. And sustainable practices in our household, in our garden, in our purchasing practices. And, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Toby?
Toby?
Yeah.
You mentioned before education. Critically important here too, okay, all the way through this subject. Education is really important. Research is really important. And we've got to aim to reduce the food miles of the food we consume. We can't always do it, but where we can, we should. And I want to end on this note, because I'm a researcher. This is incredibly important. Global research and innovation, okay? How can we answer any questions, let alone hope to solve them, if we don't have adequate and reliable data? We have to know what's going on. So we need to invest some money into this. And the government should be investing loads of money into this. And at least in Australia, it is not yet. This must change. So investment in agricultural research today drives the growth and resilience of the food supply for tomorrow. Precision viticulture that I mentioned before is pictured here, down on the left. Okay, that's pretty much what you look at when all of these factors are layered one on top of the other. This will help us learn what we need to know about our agricultural production. But it also needs to be multilateral, so across nations, and consultative. We need to be held accountable for what we do by other countries and vice versa. And we need to share any information that we gain from research with other countries in the world. It's incredibly important. We have to educate, we have to share the information. Without that, we can't innovate. And without that, we can't learn. And we can't fix the problem. So that's what I want to leave you on. And next week, you'll hear from Rachel Carey, who's here at the university, and she'll talk to you about global food security, hunger, its causes, and policy approaches.
couldn't even register as like yeah. Well, yeah, there's some allocations. So is it because I'm just waiting for work from a business that I get started? And if I do, I'm going to do a shoot on the beginning or end of the day. So if that's alright, I'll just
keep us posted.
yeah.
And we'll sort something out.
No, I'd like to make it. I'd like to make it. Yeah. And we'll hopefully pay it on
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a great shift.
Yeah, and it is.
That's good. What are you working on?
I'm working on grad program at the but I do 6 months in pretty much seeing the banana farm was destroyed in Queensland, and how the guy comes in every 3 months just to mow it, and like they destroy all his clothes so it doesn't spread.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah,
And
no,
just
it's very
incredible
interesting.
waste that goes along.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay, anyway, thank you.
Thanks for that. That's good. So just read the readings every week. Is that all we really need to do additionally?
And it does look from what I've noticed, but it is quite cumbersome.
Yeah.
So I might just try and find shit.
Awesome, that's good. Yeah, I found that with a lot of the subjects in the masters. It's just like, you know, you got your lecture and then it's just like 4 long chapters to read for
And
each
you just can't
subject.
take it all in.
Yeah, there's a lot to read. Yeah.
Once you get to the text.
Yeah, and especially when it's online, I find it hard to note take and like just jot down the vital points to remember. So, but you know, yeah, that'd be awesome if you just like identify the really useful ones. That'd be sweet. Thanks,
I
Dad.
aim to do that in the next few weeks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Cheers. See ya.
Not question, but I'm pretty interested in dairy products, and like, is there any researchers are doing research, to like try to see with their like cow beef, how's it, generations? So we are doing this sort of research because we are doing this kind of business back to China. So, yeah.
And so, are you enrolled through
Master.
veterinary and agricultural sciences?
Yes, I'm specialized in agribusiness.
Yeah, no, there are plenty of people in the faculty that are aligned with what you're interested in.
Oh, so how could I find out?
Well, I think you'll probably meet some during these lectures, but also, you know how there's a campus up there?
No.
There's a Melbourne University campus up there.
Oh, yeah, do keep
There's lots of people involved in animal production and things there.
Oh,
So,
you just go that.
I'd get onto the website, the Duke website, and it will list the research and the teaching that is done.
So just kind of search
And
animal
they usually
production.
people that will come between Part 4 and Duke. And so you might identify some people that you want to talk to.
Sure.
And you might find that they're here in Phil part of the week, and you could go and see them. So probably as a starting point, I'd look at the Dookie link on the Melbourne Uni website.
And I search animal production.
Yeah.
And
And
also,
there's a degree out there, for example. There's some horticultural crops. There's a range of different things.
okay.
I'm sure you'll find people of interest.
And also, like, relating to my major, like, how could I, or what kind of, like, because I'm quite confused about the course I'm doing right now, because it's security food. So what's, like, how could I relate it to my major business style? Yeah, because we're doing carpet, so that's why I chose to start, because beef for dairy products here is quite famous, and the reason I chose this course because I have kind of like no background of this area actually. So I would like to know more about like how it's going to relate with it.
Yeah, well, I think if this is your first semester,
Yes, I do.
I think that it'll start to become clearer as you go through your lectures and listen to the speakers. I think the links and the direction that you're going in will start to become clearer. But there are certainly people who you can talk to within the faculty who will be able to help you sort of hone that direction.
Yeah.
But I would probably suggest to you that just for the next few weeks, just listen to a few of the lecturers and settle in to your course, and then go, right, I need to go and talk to such and such.
Oh, right, yes. Yes.
I think it'll become clearer.
Thank you.
No problem.
Bye.
See you next week.
Extreme screen 啊。
星期六4点9个字是4点45吗？对。
修多长？
他是传的吗？传写过来的。搞个字吗？搞就是9个字。CD 搞个字。
生超时代的跟你说几点？9个字，9个字。
什么语言的掺在一起？
对啊，有时候听你们说话啊，中文好像在讲粤语，好像有福建话。粤语，他们说话，普通话、福建话、粤语，有的时候常见马来语变成英文，话特别快转换，在讲。就是我看美剧，那个美剧叫做《Frasier》。是我们研究，他有一个英语、西班牙语、法语、俄语，其实用超级高，是吧？就他们，我刚考完，
没有其他时间吗？
其他时间没有，我觉得4点45分，但是雷达和他妈妈，他和我妈就妈妈，对吧？他和我妈就妈妈，叫什么？杨呢？我去，我的天！有人叫妈，我从来不讲，不叫妈。你们叫妈？说了没出声。妈妈。
But there are
一段时间在小学里头就，可说是看不着那老头，然后老师就开始骂他。
那老头儿，你说别人不行，但你说的是那个，
就是他班长知道，他老师在为什么看不着那老头，跟坐正骂的。
我一般跟你们说的话，我爸爸或者我爸或者
我是你爸，
你说我老头儿，我家
我你说我家老头说你的丈夫，
他是Saturday 就一个4年15平均1场，一周4天。
不知道，因为我打算跟我几个朋友一起，还是不同了。你买你的，他
是没回我问一下，都是我原来群里问的没回我。
学的 PS，那你吧？
我上课教。
对。什么矢量图，我都学了。我们老师，我跟你讲过没？我们老师让我交毕业作品，我到现在都没交过。1年前让我做的，
你去学它，专门去学它。
对。
那我可以跟你学。大神。
学个鬼啊！我就是学了个屁，就像日本人学那种。
差不多，也就是对的，
一定的。
太多了，比起我，最小的是200。200的 low，200的是 low 啊，200的大概就是可以
而且不是阶梯式的，除了那个教授，我觉得其他的教授，
好像是那因为毕竟是新的那个，
他感觉和其他学校比起来，也有点。
但是跟瑞一点有关系，瑞毕竟是去年